Thank you so much for coming through, Francis. I know the journey for you to get here was long and hard, so the time is very much appreciated. I think just to set the scene, tell us a little bit about yourself. You obviously work for the Starkware team, quite a well-known team within the space. But for anyone that doesn't know a little bit about Starkware, maybe just kind of give an overview of yourself and the team.
Yeah, so I'm Francis. I've been in the crypto space, I think, since 2016 at this point. I actually started in college. I worked at LedgerX, which was the first federally regulated derivatives exchange in the United States. Then I worked at Anchorage Digital, which was the first national bank in the US. Then I decided I really wanted to switch it up. So we decided to go sort of the decentralized route, and I moved over to Starkware. Starks are scalable, transparent arguments of knowledge, so essentially zero-knowledge proofs without trusted setups and based on hash functions. I was really excited to join the team just because there was a good sort of background of professors, people I could learn from, and a team I was really excited about.
Yeah, and this topic is actually quite one I'm personally excited about as well. Starks on Bitcoin. So quite like a quick overview of what Starkware was before. It was an L2 scaling solution for the Ethereum ecosystem. A lot of the values within the Starkware team and kind of the tech that they've built is very much Ethereum aligned. And one random cool quick shout out actually, the Starkware team just created a little update on their new ZK processor that can kind of do a whole bunch of transactions. So they've been very much at the front, of building the most forward-thinking technology at the moment, and now have moved on to the Bitcoin side of things. So we'll kind of jump into the Bitcoin scaling side of it, a little bit more about the contentious side of the Bitcoin community, but maybe just as a quick introduction, run through why did Starkware choose this path? What was kind of the thinking behind that, and the thesis about why choosing Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I actually think one thing which is not commonly known is this was actually kind of always the plan for Starkware. If you look back at 2013, you'll see a San Jose Bitcoin conference, one of the first kind of major Bitcoin conferences. Though if you look at the room, it's about as empty as this one, so not that many people there. But Ellie actually talked there about using snarks for super scaling Bitcoin, and that was followed up by sort of a Bitcoin talk post by Greg Maxwell, who's one of the better known Bitcoin developers. So that sort of kicked things off. The reality was, though, that was 2013. And at that point, Starks did not yet exist. And from that point forward, Bitcoin didn't change much, right? The ability to actually verify a zero-knowledge proof on Bitcoin with the moon math of the time was not something that was easily adaptable to Bitcoin. So Starkware started to be okay, where else can we go? And with the advent of Ethereum, I think in 2016, Starkware launched and became sort of the first L2 for Ethereum proper, or first roll-up L2 of the sort of StarkX. So it wasn't ever that they didn't ever want to do Bitcoin. Right? They always did. They always wanted to do Bitcoin. The question was, when would Bitcoin actually open up to allow a Stark proof to get verified on Bitcoin? And that was always sort of an open question and something that we never knew if we would even. And still today, we don't necessarily know if we'll ever get the opportunity to do.
Yeah, that ties into a point that I think is quite interesting about the debate that's happening right now with everything that's Starkware is kind of putting forward. A lot of this technology relies, or what you guys are wanting to build, is specifically on the OPCAT opcode. Maybe just before we kind of that's quite a in the weeds detail. Maybe just kind of run through a little bit about what OPCAT is. We can kind of maybe run into some of the conversation around why did Starkware choose that, and then we can kind of run into the alternatives.
Yeah. So actually, I think it makes sense to again sort of go back 10 plus years and talk about where did OPCAT come from to begin with. OPCAT actually is an opcode. So Bitcoin has, I believe, 52 different commands. OPCAT used to be one of those, along with mole and a few others. And Satoshi in 2012 realized that there was a denial of service vector on Bitcoin. So we got a little bit concerned. You could essentially make an exponentially growing script via using opcat and opdupe together, so it would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so he sort of panicked immediately, and rather than put a limit on the number of scripts that you could use, he just said, no, screw it, let's take all of these things out. So he sort of did a little bit of a panicky thing, but opcat was actually something that was originally in Bitcoin. So when I first decided to go to Starkware, I got really excited just by the nature of Stark proofs and that there was no trusted setup and that they were based on very battle-tested crypto assumptions. And I felt that that was something that worked really nicely with Bitcoin as a whole, right? It just fit. So I was thinking more on like a 10-year time horizon. Maybe we see an enshrined ZK opcode on Bitcoin. If you talk to like some really hardcore Bitcoiners, they'll say the only ZK or the only tech from the shitcoin world that they really like is ZK. But like generally speaking, ZK is very, very highly thought in the Bitcoin world. People like ZK. People specifically like Stark proofs. Opcat was not something that we necessarily realized was super useful up until recently, when we had a team come to us. They were called QED, and they were just sort of experimenting with Bitcoin script and using the 52 different opcodes within Bitcoin in order to emulate arithmetic. So once we realized, okay, we can emulate arithmetic, but like, what is sort of the bottleneck, right? What is stopping us from being able to verify Stark proof? Because we have the math, right? And in the end, it turned out that the heaviest thing was actually just the ability to verify Merkle paths, right? So when we realized, oh, okay, we can't really verify Merkle paths cheap, the next question was, how could we verify Merkle paths cheaply? So in order to verify Merkle paths, you need to do some hashing, and then you need to do some combining, right? What we have in Bitcoin very cheaply, it actually does it, maybe better than anyone else, is we have very cheap op SHA-256. So we can do SHA-256, we can hash something in Bitcoin script extremely cheap. But we can't combine two different things and hash them together because we don't have opcat or concatenate. So it was sort of like a light bulb moment for us where we suddenly realized that the most popular Bitcoin upgrade was exactly what we needed in order to verify a Stark proof, right? Like we'd done the math, how many, the big brains at Starkware can say, okay, we need to do this many multiplications, we need to do this many additions, we need to do this many hashes, right? So they said, we need way too many hashes to do this without opcat. And when they realized that, hey, maybe we could get opcat, we sort of set out to start building and see if maybe, this is something that we could get launched as a proof of concept. So that's how we actually stumbled on CatMap. First, we approached the problem of like, why can't we do this right now? And then as we were looking at why can't we do this right now, we realized the missing ingredient was something that the Bitcoin community was already sort of like actively attacking. So we sort of just jumped on the train. We were very excited to do so.
Yeah, I think the debate has been, I wouldn't call it polarizing or even contentious, it's just been heated. And I think kind of the Bitcoin ecosystem has been, from the Ethereum perspective, very much plagued by the idea of like, conservatism. They're very much stalwart, less change is more. And that whole kind of like debate really got sparked off, I personally think, with the advent of like ordinals and runes and, the poster child for all kind of Bitcoin scaling previous to that was Lightning, the Lightning Network and the Lightning Labs implementation of that. There's various other versions of that. Kind of it's well documented as to why Lightning doesn't really scale and some of the constraints around this. This is somewhat completely different and definitely not the only scaling solution. So like while OPCat is like one version of this, there's also OPCTV, and this whole like protocol upgrade debate has been kind of like front and center. I think kind of one interesting part about this is that like for OPCat to even just be accepted and therefore like stocks and Bitcoin to be prevalent and you can kind of build out all the fantastic things that happen on that, you really need to get like Bitcoin consensus behind it. And somebody needs to write the line of code that's going to be accepted and ultimately be deployed. Starkware's actually done a lot of effort in the, I would say, like pushing the agenda. You guys had a couple of announcements, some like research grants, for and against, and you kind of really been pushing the agenda on just that front. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, so let me say something about one of your earlier points, which was like Bitcoin and Ethereum, I think in some senses are not always that far away. So Lightning Network is sort of like the perfect example of that. And you can see that in actually something that happened a bit recently, which is I believe Vitalik is pushing for much faster block times, right? So that we can have what I believe are called based rollups where they're sequenced on the L1. Why do we want to sequence things on the L1? It's because generally speaking, we don't really want to rely on an L2 alternative consensus mechanism because it's not quite as strong. So I will say one strength that Lightning Network does have, which I really appreciate it for, and there are other qualms I have with it, like a liveness requirement, is the fact that it doesn't have to have an alternative consensus system. So I wouldn't say what Starkware is building is necessarily to replace Lightning. It's just it's an alternative. In terms of like opcat versus opctv, right? I don't think there's a reason that we can't have both, right? CTV and CAT though are extremely different things. So CTV is pretty straightforward, right? When you deploy it, you sort of have to know all the potential outcomes because you're just checking a template, which is sort of pre-made. So it's a pre-made covenant package. The reason that I don't think it generated a huge amount of kind of, we'll say, rough consensus in the Bitcoin community was because Bitcoiners sort of decided, hey, we do want covenants at this point, they didn't necessarily think that maybe CTV was powerful enough for us to sort of use our bullet on. Opcat is a bit different in that it's actually what I consider ambidextrous. So it has a very, very powerful covenant side to it, which can, both do transaction introspection dynamically, sort of on the fly. It can do cross-block introspection. It's extremely flexible. It's going to be real chunky. It's not going to be as streamlined as CTV. It won't have great congestion control properties to it like CTV does. It'll be super ugly, but it'll get the job done. And sometimes it's nice just to get the job done. So that's part of what makes Opcat really powerful. And I'd say that's maybe the right hand. The left hand is the concatenation portion, right? Like you actually can verify Merkle paths, which turns out to be pretty important in computer science. So I think that's one of the other things that differentiates Opcat from the bunch here. It's got like 2 different properties to it, which make it super interesting. And yeah, so it's not like Opcat versus OpCTV. I think that they're both great. I would love to see both of them merged into Bitcoin. Even now, you're starting to see like great script restoration talk. So it's like, why just add back Opcat? We can add back OpMol, and we can add back like all these other not crazy things, but like all the other things that you sort of need to have a functioning script on Bitcoin. Why not just add them all back? Well, we can kind of get most of it done with Cat, to be honest with you. So we don't need to wait per se, but the talks have really opened up generally around the Bitcoin community of like, maybe we do want to open up a bit because we have gotten to see Ethereum experiment a bit and see what works and what doesn't work. And at this point, one thing which I think both Ethereum and Bitcoin can agree on is that like a lot of this computation should be executed on a layer 2 and verified on a layer 1, right? So in some ways, I think Bitcoin's conservatism in that way has been kind of nice because we've gotten to see sort of on some other blockchains, like what has the optimal scaling path looked like. And it hasn't necessarily been, naive re-execution on the L1. So did Bitcoin really need to have complex computation on the L1? Did it need to introduce that to the L1? Maybe not, right? If we don't need to introduce it to the L1 and we're going to have better performance on the L2, we probably want to do it on L2, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Monero. We'll throw that in there.
Wholeheartedly agree with that whole sentiment, and I think kind of the juxtaposition here was, if you think about like the debates that happened with Bitcoin scaling, which was the last time the Bitcoin debate got interesting, and it was the whole Bitcoin Cash, the block size wars. Anyone who's very interested in reading like kind of the theories behind that and some of the political movements that happened within the ecosystem, that's been amazing. I'm getting a sense of that same thing here, and like referencing is Opcat the better version, is OpCDV a better version, and then by the way, those aren't the only ones. Those are just the most commonly like referenced ones. There are hundreds of other ones, and it's really just because like developers are saying, oh, okay, now that we can do these things, oh, what about these 500 other things? And they're kind of seeing different like implementations of how they could make that work, and that's reignited a lot of that debate. And I think, for me personally, that's been amazing just to watch and kind of see the Bitcoin ecosystem grow on like an alternative, because they kind of had their mind set on the whole one route that they had, and for better or worse, they went very deep into that one. Lightning being what I'm referencing here, and your kind of like your comments earlier was very much spot on. And in terms of just like how we see, like in my view, is that I even think that the whole idea of what's happening with these debates on OPCat and OPCDV will also actually translate to what's actually being built on top of Lightning, because there can be other ways of actually using Lightning. Arcs, I think, a good example of that. They're also a great and well-respected team within the space. But kind of like one thing I wanted to like really get towards is like just this like concept of like, how do we convince the developers of Bitcoin Core to ultimately input this like into like the protocol. It's not as simple as just like, hey, let's make an EIP, even though quite fundamentally it is, like in the Ethereum space. That path to the integration is a little bit easier. How have you guys approached it on the Bitcoin side?
Yeah, so there's actually sort of like 3 different components to this. First of all, you touched on like what we call the New York Agreement. So essentially you had a group of companies and large Bitcoin miners get behind the wheel and say, hey, this is the Bitcoin that we want. It's a compromise. You guys are going to get sort of transaction malleability / SegWit that you guys want, but then we're going to get to double the block size. So it's going to be SegWit 2x, right? That was literally a closed door meeting where people signed a piece of paper, which is very much against what the Bitcoin sort of the Bitcoin ethos is, right? So that in and of itself, that was the problem. It wasn't a technical qualm. It was this isn't the way we're supposed to do things. So after that happened, there was famously a letter written by, I believe, the South Korean Bitcoin meetup. I think Rumen was the guy that ended up writing the letter, but that sort of sparked outrage and sort of this rebel fork on Bitcoin where it said like, hey, this isn't what we're about, right? And you know what? Honestly, makes a lot of sense. And to this day, there are people that say, hey, maybe in the future we will have to 2x block size, right? But it wasn't about the technical there. So that's one thing that needs to be avoided, I think, this time. We want to make sure that this doesn't end up being a, corporation-driven change, right? We're not actively reaching out to Coinbase and saying hey, give us off-cat, right? We're trying to take a very different path as Starkware and say, hey, let's actually reach out to core developers and let's say, give us reasons to do opcat, give us reasons not to do opcat, and let's actually discuss this in an open format. We'll put the funds in sort of this grant committee, and then that grant committee can distribute them so that it's evenly and fairly done. We do talk, I'll talk to miners because that's sort of my background. But for the most part, Bitcoin miners have no interest in doing a contentious hard fork on Bitcoin again. It simply didn't work out. History does, rhymes, but it doesn't always reason. I don't know how exactly that goes, but I don't really see it going down quite like that. It's also just different characters, right? Comparing Taproot Wizards and Bitmain and Coinbase and some of these other characters that are around during the New York Agreement it's a weird comparison. I think it makes some sense. You have this one sort of outsized voice, but it's a bit different, I think, on paper. In terms of what threshold looks like for Bitcoin to actually merge something, it's not the most it's not a popularity contest. It is to some extent. Popularity gets you going, right? You have to be popular enough to be, part of the discussion. But it's when you're popular enough, are there good arguments to why we shouldn't do this that are still being made, right? So when there lacks people who are arguing against why we shouldn't do opcat, or when the people who are arguing why we shouldn't do opcat are all just saying stupid stuff and are wrong. For example, I don't like Taproot Wizards. That's why we're not doing opcat. Screw those guys. That's probably not a great reason not to do opcat, but there might be some really good other ones, right? One that we sort of discussed recently was, could opcat introduce miner extractable value to Bitcoin? The answer maybe turned out to be no, but that's not something that is necessarily fully solved yet. So it's answering those types of questions and sort of getting that, not consensus of why we should do this, but a lack of dispute. The third thing I would say, and I think this is a big one, is Bitcoin developers have traditionally, or I guess recently, been pretty severely attacked by Craig Wright. So if I was in their seat and there's 5 of them who are able to make changes to Bitcoin Core, I wouldn't be super excited to do that. I'm not sure why anyone would. It's not a great job. So figuring out sort of that bit, right? Where does Bitcoin go from here? Where, when you do make a pretty non-trivial change, even if it's very small in code, it does have a pretty significant effect on how Bitcoin scales and what Bitcoin looks like going forward. Who wants to do that? That's another question that sort of needs to be asked. So I would say those 3 things, A, we need to make sure that we don't fall down this New York Agreement. Everything needs to be out in the public. We need to be having these discussions openly. We need to make sure that we not only have consensus of why we should do this, but we don't have people who still have good arguments as to why we shouldn't do this. And what was the last one? I'm blanking now. This is the buffering after a 20-hour flight. But yeah, I think that's sort of that's the MO on it. We need to figure out again who's going to be the one to actually merge this into Bitcoin Core, and if it's going to go through Bitcoin Core. But those are questions that are not for me. I'd say that's for the people who've been around the Bitcoin Core developer world for the last 15 years, I guess.
Yeah, I think other than just simply having a 20-hour flight and then being able to explain that to a crowd like that succinctly, I think is a testament. So very much appreciated on that. And I don't think you've missed a beat on any of that. But like, okay, so one of the interesting parts about like the whole, like, earlier I was mentioning, okay, Ethereum does it this way, Bitcoin does it that way. One of the questions that came up, and like quite like heavily when you kind of announced this like announcement to build Bitcoin stocks, was where does the ethos lie of Starkware? Very traditionally and kind of like strongly Ethereum aligned, now building an entire ecosystem, and we've kind of like debated a little bit about like what's different in either space. Does this change Starkware's mission? Does this change Starkware's values? Does it change how you guys approach these problems based on what we originally founded on?
I would say no. Like a lot of times you'll see, at least on Twitter, and I'm not one of these, but like they'll write like we're Stark maxis. I'm not like Bitcoin maxi. I'm not an Ethereum maxi. I'm a Stark maxi. I think it's super corny, but to be honest, it actually is quite nice in this case. It gives me a good way to sort of put this. They are Stark maxis, right? Like a lot of the people that work at Starkware, to be honest with you, are just people who absolutely love math. Like these people, they love math so much. So that's the thing. I think it's really true. They are Stark maxis at the end of the day. We've sort of built ourselves as unaligned in the past, which I think is quite cool, right? We're Cairo, we're not EVM. But no, I don't think it changes anything. I think we've always been a bit unaligned. I think we've always pretty openly had this real taste for Bitcoin. And I don't think it changes our interest in continuing to scale Ethereum at all, right? Like it's 0%. So no, I actually think it's like very on brand. There have been people in the past who have like asked me why this didn't happen sooner. I was like, well, we didn't really know how to do it sooner. So no, I don't think it changes anything. And we can talk quickly, I guess, about what we call rollout, or James Prestwich called rollout more aptly. But like our plan is to scale 2 different blockchains at the same time. So the way that we plan to do that is, and I'm going to speak at a super high level here because this is where we really get out of my level of technical acumen when we start talking about like, oh, what if there's like a rollback on one chain but not the other? But essentially the idea is it's almost like a choice for users, right? Or app developers. They can have their data availability post on, just Bitcoin. And then if something goes wrong on Ethereum, they're okay. They can post on Bitcoin and Ethereum where they're sort of, they could have an issue with both, right? Like if something goes wrong on Bitcoin, you're kind of screwed on Ethereum. If something goes wrong on Ethereum, you're kind of screwed on Bitcoin, or you can just do Ethereum. So I really like that, actually, to be honest. It's not just bringing them together, but it's like if you guys don't want to be together as a specific app developer, you don't have to do that. So I quite like that sort of, that you have a choice.
Yeah, I guess the kind of way of like being to kind of like define as like dual settlement layers, right? And I think, frankly, from my side, when you kind of think of dual settlement layers, that like sounds like it's going to complex things, and it definitely will. But it also sounds like it's going to increase some sort of security. There's feelings of it being kind of like, the sum total of the value of your settlement now is going to be more than just the component parts added together. And so, and no one else has actually basically been trying that out. Like, I think there's been attempts at figuring out, like, on the bridging side, many bridges have tried to figure out, like, how do we dual settle between 2 chains in the most efficient way? Famously hard problem. Many of the bridges have had problems to this day. And so, like, I think maybe not on the, like, moving assets between the chains, but, like, maybe finalizing some sort of state and some sort of, like, diff transition, that might be more interesting. And so, personally, from my side, I'm very keen to see how that plays out. We've got a couple of minutes left. I'd be curious to hear what's, like, the thing that you're most excited for being built on top of this. Like, obviously, the path to get there, we've kind of spoken about in detail, but, like, what future excites you the most about once this is out there in the world?
Oof. So like my normal answer here is actually very niche. It's called braid pool. I'd really like to see decentralized Bitcoin mining pools. It's not an easy problem, but that's one thing. I would love to see sort of like a private, like a privacy chain. I think that'd be cool. I don't want to build it myself. Someone else can go to jail. But like I think it'd be cool if someone did that. And then also just like general computation on Bitcoin via delegated computation in general. I think it's just, no one has scaled a blockchain like that. And I think it would really add a lot of, it's just a new approach at the end of the day, right? Like Bitcoin is a $1.2 trillion asset class, though it's gone down a bit. Thanks, Germany. So it would just be really cool to see how Bitcoin would be used on a layer 2 for the first time. Again, I've worked at like exchanges in the past. I've worked on lending desks in the past. Like I understand that there is demand for yield on Bitcoin, and it's not always super easy to find, and you usually have to go through some trusted intermediary. So whether it be yield, whether it be decentralized mining pools, whether it be privacy, it's just like an entirely new paradigm for Bitcoin, but in a really safe way, which I think is very, very orthogonal to the way that Bitcoin was meant to scale. So I'm quite excited about that.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of the ethos of what was being like researched on the Ethereum side, and also actually the Cosmos side, and many of these different alt chains, to the Bitcoiners they would probably call them shit chains, but you know, a lot of that research is now making its way, and we're seeing some of the fruits of that. One kind of like area that I'm quite excited about moving forward is actually, you know, there's now like many apps being developed. Like quite famously, Babylon's a big one that's been coming out. That's a great like, you know, catalyst for the ecosystem. There's like some staking services coming out. There's L2s coming out, and there's like just that enormous like Cambrian explosion of really good ideas, like born out of what was actually fundamentally a small little hack in the beginning day. So I'd be curious, last question before we kind of wrap up. Now that it's kind of become a bit more formal and like you're seeing kind of this development growth, like how do you see Starkware being as a custodian of like maybe a direction that you'd want to see the Bitcoin ecosystem grow towards?
Okay, so like my honest opinion is I would like Starkware. We should go build stuff now. Like when Lightning did their first testnet transaction, it was like maybe 30, 40 days later, I think SegWit was merged into a version of Bitcoin Core for the first time. So I think it's really important that we show a great use case, right? Like Bitcoin has a really high standard for things. On the testnet, we don't just show like a transaction or a proof being verified. Like we also probably need to show forced exits and unilateral exits, right? Like that is the stuff I would really like to see Starkware do. I think that when you see it happen on a testnet for the first time, you'll also begin to see that push, not just Bitcoin, but Ethereum forward a little bit. I think that the only chain that currently does forced exits is StarkX. So not StarkNet, StarkX. They do forced withdrawals, but that's currently it. And I don't think that's great. I think that is something that should improve industry wide, and I think that this is a great opportunity for not just the Bitcoin world to get pushed forward, but like the whole crypto ecosystem should recognize that this is really important. If it's happening on testnet first, like we can do it on mainnet. But we just got to prioritize it.
I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been a really interesting topic, and I think I'm very excited to see a bit more about how the development goes. If anyone in the crowd wants to find out a bit more about you and what you're building, where can we find you?
I'm Stark and Lime on Twitter. That's about it. I don't know where else you would find me.
And more about Starkware?
What? Oh yeah. Oh, more at Starkware. Oh, at Starkware on Twitter. Starkware.co. We have a couple. We have a blog coming out very shortly by Victor. I can't pronounce his last name. It starts with Colo, but he's super brilliant. One of the many product managers at Starkware, which I think really make it a super special place. And I think that this is going to be a very technical piece on how Bitcoin can scale using Opcat and zero knowledge proofs, but also a very accessible one to people who don't necessarily have like a master's degree in computer science.
After that long trip, thank you so much for your time. Thanks, Francis.